Hey guys, it's DJ Pompey from No Coast, and we are here with a special off-season coronavirus quarantine episode of the Spaghetti Report. And I have here an expert on the topic we're going to discuss. Um, I'm here with David Greenspan. You want to introduce yourself?
Hey guys, my name's David Greenspan. A lot of you probably know me as the photographer guy that shows up at a lot of no coast events with a giant camera. But it turns out I'm also a lawyer, have been since 2007, and have quite a bit of experience in the law, in litigation, and in a number of related fields. But without getting into too many specifics, I'll throw it back to you, Ray.
Yeah, and you worked as a judge for some time, right?
Yeah, in Washington State, I was a part-time judge for about 5 years. I worked in four different courts on a pretty regular basis and handled a pretty broad range of responsibilities there.
So the topic we're going to discuss is ownership of a battle league, and there's a particular incident that's made me want to set some thoughts down and get some thoughts from you as well on this topic, which is a league that we follow, Smoked Out
Hmm.
in Canada, which has several divisions up there. They're kind of a regional presence, and they've done some international work as well. I think they've done some work in Washington as well, where you're from.
Hmm.
Is currently in a state of flux, and there's been kind of a contention of ownership following the falling out of some of their organizers, which is like inevitably something that happens. But then ultimately, it was left ambiguous who should be left in control of the organization, and there was some drama that unfolded from that. I think it's being brought back into more sane discussions, and I hope they work everything out for the best good that it can be. But I think that there are things when things are going well you can do to set yourself up for an easier situation when things so things don't get ambiguous, so people are on the same page. And I wanted to put those out there, given that I'm a founder of a league that's 11 years running, and there was also a lot of talk of like, could this be a legal matter? Could this go to the court? There was some threats to take it to court, which I think have diffused since then. And that's where I thought, man, there are way too many people in this conversation, including myself, that don't actually know anything about what they're talking about with respect to that. And given that you've been involved in the scene, thank you for stepping in to give your perspective as well. If people, we're not live right now, but if people have questions, they comment. I might be able to take them to you and get some follow up later. We'll see how that goes. But
Sure thing.
um, I'm not particularly close to that situation, so we're considering this more in the abstract. They inspired this question, but I'm not making any particular recommendations about their situation, except insofar as I would say, like, here's what you could do to prevent an ambiguity, a contention like this in the future. Um,
Hmm.
so first of all, like in these conversations, people talk about like, well, who owns this? It's a business or what? And like, I will say as many times as people listen that battle leagues are not businesses. Like almost no battle leagues in the history of battle leagues have been anything you could reasonably call a business. So anything that applies to what you do with a business, like, you know, um, doesn't really apply here to me, nor is it like a nonprofit organization. It's not any particular, like, these are DIY collectives, typically, that operate on shoestring budgets that don't have any revenue to speak of. What revenue there is, it just offsets the expenses, usually doesn't even recoup it, but you're not talking about profitable entities. So it's not like, if you do or don't own it means that you're entitled to some kind of revenue or anything. You know, this is this is not the type of entity this is. So that's my opinion. I don't know, if there's a legal definition of what a business is. I think a legal definition would be more like a corporation, right? Is it that or is it not, right? Or what's that mean?
Uh, no, you're kind of off base on that, and
Okay.
that's fine, and that's fine because that's a common
This
misunderstanding. A
is
lot of
why
people,
I'm asking you these questions. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the legal definition of a business is really any individual or entity that provides a good or service in exchange for something of value, and does so in a predictable manner, right? So it's not like a one-off deal where I say to my neighbor, "Hey, you want me to cut your lawn for you? Give me $10, I'll cut your lawn." Okay, that's a private individual transaction. That's a one-time thing. Now, if I go up to every single neighbor on my block and I say, "I'll cut each of your lawns for $10," and they all say, "Sure." And then this becomes a regular pattern, then technically what I'm doing is I'm running a business.
Mhm.
Now, whether or not it's profitable, whether or not it's nonprofit specifically, there's really no distinction in the law between for-profit businesses and nonprofit businesses. The only distinction that the law really makes between the two is tax purposes. What is considered taxable revenue? What is considered, uh, taxable profit? And then what you do with the revenue in your business. That's really the only distinctions that the law makes between them.
Mhm.
Um, so a rap battle league, I think, would technically fit the description of a
Yeah,
business.
in the legal definition. Thank you for
Sure.
clarifying what that is. It is then absolutely. And
Hmm.
when I use the word business in everyday speech, I don't mean the legal definition clearly
Sure. And
because it's
most
way
people
different
don't.
than what I mean. What I to clarify then what I mean that a battle rap league is not is an organization or entity like that has the purpose of making money, whether or
Sure.
not it's profitable or not. At least that is the intent, and that is not what anyone who knows what they're doing expects a battle league to do.
Sure. I think that's fair.
But it's not
And
just that's yeah, that's different than what the law what the law would say of businesses. Okay, thank you.
yeah, I think the way that you define it and the way that I've observed it in the time that I've been involved in this scene is that it's more of a labor of love. It's more of like a club,
Mhm.
where you have a group of like-minded individuals, many of which might actually be friends, getting together and doing something that they love in a sort of organized setting.
Mhm.
And uh, I know that there's this, you sell tickets for admission, and, there's these sort of VIP exclusives, and, you've got the YouTube channels and the Patreons now, and all these different avenues of getting the content out there that people are willing to pay money for. But at the end of the day, I think what you're saying is that all of those revenue streams aren't really for anybody's personal benefit. It's really more for the benefit of everyone involved in the community, so that you can continue and perpetuate this scene that you've created for yourselves.
Yeah,
Eh,
it's operating expenses like
right.
the typically the tickets you sell for any given show,
Mhm.
like your best case is that they pay for what you've spent throwing that show.
Yeah, and I think traditionally, realistically, nobody expects their league to take off and become a huge sensation that's going to be drawing in the kind of crowds that are going to fill more than your typical bar, and you're not going to be generating money to more than cover your operating expenses, as you say. But it's interesting because I don't think that that's an unreasonable way to look at it, but there have been many, many examples of similar labors of love,
Mm.
as it were, throughout the history of this country, certainly, and I imagine Canada is no different, where a group of like-minded individuals did get together, decided to do something as a group because they all wanted to do it. They all enjoyed it. They wanted to, share that experience with other people, or just enjoy it themselves. And in some instances, those kind of community endeavors will morph or evolve into something
Mhm.
else. Um, the likelihood of that happening in a rap battle league probably is not the same as, like, say, a Shakespeare festival or a community orchestra, something where there is a much broader appeal. Although,
Mhm.
that could, that could change.
Mhm.
Battle rap has actually gained quite a lot of notoriety over the last few years. There's a lot of celebrities. There's a lot of people of note coming out and actually talking about battle rap as a personal interest and
Mhm.
getting more people interested in the scene than were previously even aware that this sort of thing existed.
Yeah, and now we're talking about like what is the potential of battle rap as it's organized to
Mhm.
progress into something that's more profit driven. And obviously there are examples of network television shows that are doing some version of what could be called battle rap, like
Mhm.
you're wilding out, you're drop the mic and so forth, and like presumably those are profitable entities, right? They're television
Sure.
networks, but yeah, so that's an interesting topic, but for the purpose of this, right, like what I'm really
Mhm.
talking about is what's being contended is not like an actively profitable business, nor does it really intend to be.
Right.
In this scenario we're talking about, and I think it would be a different conversation in terms of the motivations of everyone if this were anyone's livelihood,
Absolutely.
or
Absolutely.
even close to it. And there are people that are under the impression that people who spend a lot of time doing this, that it is their livelihood, and that's just wrong. I want to dispel that.
Right.
But like no disagreement on what you've said there.
Yeah.
Just like that's kind of to the side. So then there is the notion of something that is incorporated or is a corporation. I shouldn't say incorporated because then you're an Inc. But a corporation like an LLC. Is there like a short definition of what is being defining yourself as a corporation mean?
So there's lots of different categorizations for business entities. And in the United States, we have essentially, if you wanted to keep it in broader categories, then there's essentially four categories. Um, there is what we call sole proprietorships, which is just one person doing business essentially as themselves. Not really a corporation because it is just that person, right? It's just um, their official recognition by whatever government agency that they are operating a business for profit or whatever. Then there's what we call partnerships, and partnerships are typically organizations of very few people, two, three, maybe four. Occasionally, you'll get more than four people in a partnership, but that's pretty rare.
Mm.
And that's where you start to get into this sort of abstract legal concept that we call corporation, because at its core, a corporation is any organization of multiple people uh, who are acting as a single entity. And so in a partnership, when you have, two or three people, they're working together for their mutual benefit and their collective actions are done through the partnership. So they are still free in some respect to act individually, but it depends on how the partnership is structured.
Mhm.
Then you move into more complicated versions of corporations, like you mentioned, the LLC.
Mhm.
And for those who don't know what LLC means, uh, it stands for Limited Liability Corporation or Limited Liability Company. Um, Depending on what state jurisdiction you're in, the words are relatively interchangeable, but the LL in LLC means limited liability. And an LLC is just one form of a corporation, the way that it's structured, the way that it's legally recognized, is defined individually from, typically in the United States, it's defined from state to state. There's no federal definition of what an LLC is or should be. And then you have what is called a corporation. And you mentioned, incorporation, the INC. That's typically what we think of as a standard corporation. And that can be broken down in different ways too, depending on how the corporation is organized. And that's usually for tax purposes.
Mhm.
The distinctions here don't really matter enough to go into detail about it.
Right.
But
But
at the end of
having one of these corporation entities,
Mhm.
LLCs in the states is most common for a smaller scale thing, I think. But
Yeah.
like it allows you, as you say, to limit your liability in various
Mhm.
ways. There are situations in which the individuals wouldn't be the first ones to be sued. The entity might be, but there's all sorts of crazy things that could happen there. But the main thing people do with it is for tax purposes, once you have that, there are certain kinds of expenses that become business expenses
Mhm.
for tax purposes, and then if you're investing in something, then it can
Yeah.
become a write off against your other personal income.
Sure. That's one of the benefits of incorporation, whether it's through LLC or standard incorporation. But I mean, at the end of the day, the general purpose of incorporation, and even with things like partnerships, the purpose of incorporation and having corporations is to shield individuals from liability.
Mm.
It allows people to act as a collective without any one person being personally responsible if something goes wrong. So, for example, if you have an organization, let's say that you're trying to throw an event. Okay, I'm sure everyone by now is familiar with the infamous Fire Festival and whatever that debacle was. So let's say you want to throw the next Fire Festival, but you want it to actually work. um, so you might, for that purpose, unless you're very, very independently wealthy and you're willing to take on all of the risks and responsibilities of setting something like that up, chances are what you'll do is you will set up some kind of corporation, some organization of people who are working together to make this event happen. And so that way you have the ability to do fundraising, you have the ability to contract with people, right? Because you got to have people who are going to set it up. You got to have people who are going to cater it. You got to have people who are going to be doing all the audiovisual stuff. There's a whole lot of things that go into making something like that happen. And one person is typically not going to be capable of handling all of those responsibilities themselves. But in order for that one person to not have to take on all the responsibility, what they do is they incorporate, and therefore the corporation
Mm.
becomes responsible for all that stuff. And then let's say down the road, okay, let's say that DJ Pompey wants to throw an international rap battle festival in Chicago, wants to invite a bunch of people in and wants to set it up at you know pick Soldier Field, right? And then you want to have this elaborate light show and catered food and everything, right? So you've got this grand idea in your head, and you get some other people on board, like, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. Now, if you individually said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make this happen, I'm going to set this all up, and you went out and you contracted with caterers and you contracted with tech people and you contracted with performers, and you said, you know what, I am going to make sure that all of you get paid. Okay, if you did that as yourself individually, if something went wrong,
Mhm.
each one of those people would be able to come after you personally.
I think there was a situation like this with a recent Chicago festival, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been in the news, and I don't know all the details behind it, but
But presumably, they are, them being protected as a limited liability corporation makes an appearance somewhere. Though that's got to end at some point, right? Like at some point, you
sure.
have responsibility as an individual, and I'm sure that textbooks have been written on exactly where that line is.
There is actually a very specific term of art for this. So when you set up a corporation, what you're doing is you're setting up a sort of legal shield for all of the people involved in the corporation so that none of them really can be held personally responsible if something were to go wrong. And this functions in most situations, but we have a term for this. We call this protective shield. We call it the corporate veil. And in very rare instances, there will be individuals within corporations, within entities that kind of go out, they go rogue, they go out on their own, they go well outside the scope of their authorities, their fiduciary duties, and all that stuff, and they act against the interests of the corporation. We call that malfeasance, when somebody intentionally acts not in the interest of the corporation, but either for their personal interest or to intentionally subvert or undermine the efforts and the interests of the corporation. And so when you have that kind of malfeasance, when you have that sort of intentional bad behavior, on some occasions, what that will allow uh, individual creditors or people with a financial stake, what it would allow them to do was to sue that person individually rather than the corporation. And that is called piercing the corporate veil. It's very
Mm.
difficult to do. It doesn't happen nearly as often as it should, um, but it is a thing that can happen if you have the right circumstances and you've got enough money and resources to make
Mm.
it happen.
So if a battle league is, has been organized as one of these LLCs or other kind of corp, then it is a corporation. However, most are not. And the one
Mhm.
in question is not. So they're not, for example, organizing documents that, may or may not indicate, who formally controls it. But we do have in that case, and I think most cases in which there's going to be a contention of ownership, what you'd call a partnership,
Mhm.
where several people are saying, hey, we all equally own this. So let's say you have a situation where there are three equal co owners.
Mhm.
Like, how on earth do you settle any kind of dispute between them?
That's tricky. So there's there's a
Because
lot of different things that can go that can happen in a situation like this.
and
Um,
by the way, like this is what happened in grind time. Like
mhm.
the grind time, one of the early the first like league that held the entire United States down almost.
Mhm.
Was very influential in what we when we started calling them leagues. Like
Mhm.
grind time was one of the first you'd think of,
Mhm.
and they ultimately they had three co-owners.
Mhm.
With equal weight, and ultimately, at least according to the narrative told in Ryan O's book on the history of battle rap, that led to all sorts of complications. So sorry, I cut you off there,
Sure.
but like just motivating the question, like this is not a hypothetical. This has happened, and it will happen again.
Yeah. So there's an old axiom in the legal profession. You've probably heard it before. It's possession is 9/10 of the law.
Hmm.
And when you're talking about an organization or an entity, because we're talking about a non corporeal thing, right? Something without form and substance, um, it's very difficult to define who possesses it. And this is another advantage of things like LLCs and corporations, is that they allow you to define ownership uh, by way of shares, right? So when you form a corporation, you also, as part of forming the corporation, you distribute shares of ownership, and those shares of ownership are a tangible way of establishing who owns what percentage of that organization. And LLCs work the same way, although the mechanics of how shares work with LLCs is a little bit different, and not worth getting into that. In a partnership, most partnerships are considered co-equal ownership, right? So if you have two partners in a partnership, then it's a 50-50 split in all things. It's just like
Mhm.
being married, essentially. If you have three people, then it's split in thirds. If you have four people, it's split in fourths. That's
So
typically how it works.
how would um, how would then three people get go about severing ties one with one person? Like, do they say, okay, we've got together a controlling interest, and so we have a consensus that you're not going to be a part of this anymore, but they still own a third of it. Like, what happens there?
That's difficult to say, and that's unfortunately where the courts often get asked to intervene, is where people can't resolve their differences and can't come to terms with whatever is going on when an organization splits up. And that's one of the big challenges of any organization, whether it's a partnership or a corporation, is that just like in a typical relationship, right? Nobody expects the breakup. Nobody wants the breakup to
Mm-hmm.
happen. And when it does happen, it often catches people completely off guard, right? Just like, um, you know, husbands and wives don't plan to get divorced in most cases. Um, Most corporations, most partnerships don't plan to break up in the future, and they don't usually have a contingency plan in place. Now, when you're talking about something like a rap battle league or an entity whose primary function is to create events, to create services for people, there's no tangible assets, right? There's nothing physical of value that can be split up between them. You can argue that, the name, the brand is itself something of value, but there's typically only
Yeah.
one of those.
So
And if you,
so let's we're getting into a good thing to. I wanted to break this down. Like, here's what I see as the what a league as an asset actually entails, right?
Mhm.
And you mentioned some of them, right? I think there are in spirit there are branding rights. There's
Mhm.
the ability to either put out content or throw events that like have the flag, the banner on them, and
Mhm.
like we can throw events as no coast raps. If anyone else does it, they're a dick. you know um,
Mhm.
and we may or may not have any recourse, but as the community would not acknowledge that as legitimate if it were not like co-signed by the people who understood to be like the people who are supposed to be saying we're no coast
Mhm.
refs. And Smoked Out Battle League has got like a similar thing, like the branding rights. I use rights in kind of um, a loose sense there.
Mhm.
Are kind of at stake there. There is a trademark that is alleged to be held that one of the parties has, and we can
Mhm.
talk about whether in a minute whether or not that what that might impact. There's also control of the resources, right? The social accounts, the YouTube channel, and there's potentially the copyright on all the back catalog of footage,
Mhm.
which may not ever become directly monetarily valuable other than microscopic YouTube ad payments. And again, very different conversation if it were
Well,
macroscopic ad payments.
so let me just
Yeah.
jump in really quick for a second on the things that you just mentioned, like the videos and copyrights and things like that. That gets even trickier
Mhm.
because typically the way it works with audio and visual copyrights is that the copyright by default belongs to whoever shot the video or took the photo. So by default, the photographer or the videographer is the one who owns the copyright. And so unless there is something in writing, something documenting that individual, the videographer, photographer, whoever, uh, signing over the copyright to the league, it's not theirs to begin with. They might be using it on their YouTube channel or their
Mhm.
Facebook page or whatever other social media with permission of the videographer. Um, but that doesn't mean that they actually own it.
Mhm.
Um,
So
and then,
that's an interesting point. So what you're saying here is
mhm,
that use with implicit or explicit permission is very distinct from the person who owns it, in this case the videographer, actively handing over the copyright.
absolutely,
And
it's
it's a
just
different kind of release that might be involved in that.
yeah, it's just like to use software as a metaphor, right? If you write a program, you can license it so that other people are able to use the program, but the source code is still yours. You still own what makes that program functional. And the same is true for photos and videos. If somebody took the picture, if somebody took the video, it's theirs. The raw material is theirs. What they do with it is within their discretion, and unless they have signed away their ownership, their rights to that image or that video, it remains theirs until that copyright expires,
Mhm.
and that can actually be several decades in some instances. So that shouldn't even be a point of contention here for them, really.
Well,
if the
it's
video,
not a point of contention if they haven't actually obtained proper legal ownership of their material,
right?
and which we'll assume that they haven't because none of us have, right? Like very
Yeah,
seldom have we, and so then, but that you still have control, right? You have control of whether that content's online anymore. If you're going to take it and,
sure.
like control over the YouTube channel and so forth. And that it's like you say, possession is 9/10 of the law. So you have a situation where there's different factors in play. There's the factors of certain people believe, based on old, informal conversations, that they own some percentage of whatever this is. There's one party that says that they have a registered trademark with
Hmm.
the name. Another party, it's probably one of the first two, that is the one that's currently in control of the, Facebook group admin status and the YouTube channel and the social logins, right? And then you got to try to figure out, well, given these, if these people aren't going to come together, even if they are, like,
Hmm.
how do you decide, now who controls this thing? And it's probably not clear cut at all, right?
No, it really wouldn't be. Again, whoever has the possession of whatever's in question is the one that really uh, has the claim of ownership, right? So if somebody's saying that they have a trademark and they've got all the paperwork showing that they've registered that trademark and their name's on the paper, um, then they have a claim to ownership of that trademark. However, if the trademark was registered in the name of the corporation, in the name of the organization, then things get a little bit trickier
Mm-hmm.
because then,
Then it's back
yeah,
to who
you
controls
go
the
back to who
corporation then.
actually, yeah.
Now, in this case, I don't believe that and in most of these cases, it wouldn't have been, like, in spirit, it might have been in the name of the entity, but it probably wasn't in practice actually filled out that way because there wasn't such an entity to act, or that lay people were doing it.
Yeah.
So then you would have to, if you wanted to say, no, it's not really yours, it's really ours, you were just performing the administrative task of registering that website or that trademark, you would have to make all kinds of arguments to establish that. You wouldn't be able to just say, oh yeah, it's in the docs.
Right.
Another thing that you could do, I think, a maneuver that has been done before, is, oh, you've got the trademark, okay, we're now smoked out now. That's why grind time became grind time now, is because some party
Hmm.
that they worked with, that wasn't an owner, but that had done some, I think, website work for them, registered some kind of trademark or something, and then they had a falling out over some dispute, and they just renamed grind time as grind time now, and continued just doing exactly what they're going to do. And so, like, okay, nice trademark. my guy, but we're not like such an established brand that it really matters that we're calling ourselves exactly the same thing. We can just become smoked off instead of smoked out, or smoked out battles instead of smoked out battle league, or whatever. Do you think that that's like a valid tactic? Could someone then challenge you to say, hey, you're not using the exact thing that's on my trademark, but in spirit you're violating it? Like, what could happen there?
So this is really a question of money and a question of resources, because in the eyes of the law, when it comes to trademarks and copyrights, the main legal driving principle behind them is, does it create confusion within the consumer base? Right. So we look at two things and we look at them and we say, are they so substantially similar to one another that
Mm-hmm.
they create confusion? And there's a lot of different examples of, where this can go horribly wrong within the United States. I can't speak for Canada, of course, but famous incident in the United States is, there was a brewery in New England somewhere. I don't remember where. It might have been Connecticut or Rhode Island, or one of those areas. But they, small time brewery, nothing major, but they named themselves Billy Budd after a character in a Herman Melville novel. And they got sued by Budweiser, saying, Budweiser said, you're violating our trademark, you're violating our copyright over the name Bud, because your product, Billy Bud, sounds too similar to Bud for Budweiser, and
Mm.
it's going to confuse consumers and it's going to cause us to lose profits. Now, in your practical, rational mind, you might look at that situation and think, there's nothing similar about those two things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Billy Budd is it's character from a book. Budweiser, the king of beers. Nobody is going to confuse those two things
Mm-hmm.
with one another. That's where you'd be wrong. The courts absolutely found in favor of Budweiser in that case and said, yeah, this is copyright infringement.
Mm.
And so just because you've added a word or you've changed something slightly to try to distinguish yourself doesn't mean that you're necessarily safe from consequences. But again, it's going to come down to money and resources and drive,
Right.
because if you're an organization like Budweiser, you've got all the money and all the lawyers in the world, and you can go after whoever you want for whatever petty reason you want.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about a rap battle league in Canada, chances are that the individuals involved don't have the money or the legal power or really the dedication to spend potentially 2 to 5 years of their life arguing about this in court
Yeah,
to
and
try and
tens of thousands of dollars at the low end.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, unless you're going to go in, representing yourself. I mean, and that's ultimately another challenge that comes up with all this. Like, you asked in the very beginning of all this, um, is it even really a legal issue, right? Well, I'll tell you right now, anything is a legal issue
Mm-hmm.
if you
And it
try
can
hard
be.
enough.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But your question actually brings up a really, really good point, whether you realize it or not when you said it. Um, Much of how the law operates and much of how um, cases like these are resolved comes down to what the perceived value of controversy is, and that's where this is an unpredictable situation, right? Because on the one hand, as you said, a rap battle league is generally not a profitable enterprise. People aren't doing this to get rich. People aren't even doing this really to make money. People are mostly doing this to have fun and to make sure that events like these keep happening so that they can keep having fun. Nobody is a professional rap battler. Everybody involved in these processes has day jobs or is looking for one. Um, and so the underlying question here is what really is the value of all of this? And you can look at certain measurable metrics, right? Like, t-shirt sales, right? How many t-shirts did you sell in a year? Ticket sales, how many tickets did you sell? What was the overhead cost? You can break those numbers down, but at the end of the day, if the value in controversy is really, really low, it doesn't mean that you can't sue. It just means that your options are going to be significantly more limited.
Mhm.
Now, I don't know if they have what we would call in this country small claims court in Canada. I'd be shocked if they didn't. Um, but to me, it seems like this is exactly the kind of thing that would be handled in small claims court. This is
Mhm.
not something that would be handled in, a typical courtroom with a judge and jury. This is something where, you would have a couple of people go in front of a magistrate and basically say, you know, this is what I think is fair. And then the other person would get their shot at saying, this is what I think is fair, and then ultimately it would be at a judge's discretion to
Mhm.
determine what the best possible solution is. And we refer to that as equity in the law. When we talk about equity in the law, we're talking about what is going to be the most fair outcome for everyone involved. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything relating to money. It can be distribution of property. It can be the rights to use or not use certain things, or it could be something as simple as turning over administrative privileges on a YouTube channel. And if it's small claims court, judges get a lot of discretion in small claims court, and they can craft all kinds of solutions to all kinds of different problems. But at the end of the day, what I can say fairly confidently is that nobody is going to make a lot of money from bringing a lawsuit here. I think if anybody makes
Mhm.
any money off of a lawsuit, it's going to be whatever schmuck lawyers they hire and
Mhm.
whatever they charge per hour in order to do their thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And but of course, people have gone to court for strictly sentimental reasons or
Absolutely.
vindictive
It happens all
reasons.
the time.
These, yeah, like that's a whole cottage industry, not the whole
Hmm.
industry, but it's certainly people aren't necessarily rational actors. So that's
Rarely ever.
a very good point you make.
And that's the other point too. Actually, I'm glad that you said that, because one of the defining features of small claims court, at least in the United States, is that most small claims courts don't even allow attorneys in the room. They
Mm.
only allow people to represent themselves. And I'm sure you're also aware of the old saying that the man who represents himself has a fool for a client.
Mm.
And that's absolutely true. People, when they start suing, when they start throwing around the threats of lawsuits, rational thought tends to go out the door. People get very emotionally attached to the issues. They get very emotionally attached to the things in controversy, and it prevents them from thinking objectively. And that's one of the real challenges with small claims court, is because you're dealing with emotionally invested individuals, and you don't have that buffer of an attorney who's going to be able to look at the facts of the case and look at the law objectively, and give an honest opinion of, here's how I think this is going to play out. Because you don't have that buffer, small claims court can be very, very unpredictable.
Mhm.
uh, but I actually have experience adjudicating small claims court.
Oh,
And
interesting.
yeah, that was one of the things that I got to do during those 5 years when I worked as a part-time judge. And
I feel like we should do a whole extra episode sometime just about that.
I'd be happy to talk about it anytime. But one of the things that I always did whenever I had to run small claims court, and this was taught to me by an elected judge who I considered something of a mentor to me. Um, Before every small claims court calendar, what I would do is I would gather all the people in the room who were there to litigate whatever claims they were there for. I'd gather them all into the courtroom and I would give them a speech that amounted essentially to, okay, all of you are here because you have a dispute that you want to resolve. And my job is to resolve that dispute for you. However, you have a second option. If you don't want me to resolve your dispute, you can step out into the hallway and you can talk to one another like adults and try to resolve it yourselves. Here's the advantage of doing that versus having me resolve it. If I resolve it, I'm going to pick someone who's right and someone who's wrong. And then I'm going to impose whatever I think the best solution is. And then if you're the loser, you're going to be responsible for whatever it is that I impose on you. If you're the winner, you will get a piece of paper, and that's it. You came here today thinking if I win, I'm going to get a stack of cash, right? Because that's what they're always there for. They want to get paid, right? You're not going to get paid today. You're going to get a piece of paper called a judgment. And then it is entirely your responsibility to figure out how to enforce that judgment.
Mm.
I can't tell you how to do it. I can't give you legal advice. If you don't know what you need to do in order to get your money, after you walk out those doors, you're going to have to probably go and hire a lawyer and pay them to figure it out for you. And then at the end of the day, what you may end up with is pretty close to nothing. On the other hand, if you walk out into the hallway and you talk to the other person and act like an adult, if you guys can come to an agreement amongst yourselves, maybe you actually get paid today and you don't have to go through all that trouble.
Mm.
And I'll tell you, I gave that speech on 3 or 4 different occasions. And in each circumstance, I think it whittled the calendar down from about 2 dozen cases to 2.
Wow, that's pretty effective. We need more of that in the world.
Absolutely.
More
But that's,
inspirational Picard save the day speeches
yeah.
at
But
the
that's
end.
also, that's part of the challenge, right? Is that a lot of people think that they understand how the law works and how the courts work. And they think, here's uh, this entity in the courts, or here's this person, this judge, he's going to solve all my problems. They're going to make the bad person admit that they're wrong, and they're going to give me the things that I deserve, and they're going to make everything right. And that's really not how it works.
Mm-hmm.
All judges do is make decisions. Judges don't enforce those decisions. They have other people that do it for them. And in many cases, uh, they don't even have that. It's up
Mm.
to the individuals litigating a case to figure that stuff out on their own.
So,
And
a similar thing that was brought up as a possibility was a binding arbitration. In this case, what was proposed. So it wasn't anything specific to the framework of Canadian law, but just something as a community. This is what we could do. Is someone who was experienced in the community in that the smoked out leagues scene,
mhm,
and generally respected from what I can see, and not on a side. They weren't directly involved in this dispute. Volunteered to have them or someone else similarly sort of be the arbitrator and just like, hey, you guys just go into this and agree that whatever I decide is going to be the solution, and you guys both, tell me to your heart's content your sides of the story, and then I'm just going to like try to make the best decision for the community. Do you have any thoughts on the pros and cons of that situation, which is like that's a person with no real legal experience, just like experience in that domain of the community that is
mhm.
in conflict, versus going to some kind of mediator, like you said, like a small claims, or maybe there are other
Mhm.
scenarios there where they don't necessarily know or have any stake in the situation and the domain,
Mhm.
but they of course have the legal experience.
So arbitration as an alternative to litigation has gained a lot of traction in recent years and has really been building in popularity for the last 3 or 4 decades. It's a really effective way of keeping disputes like this out of the courts so that the courts have more resources to devote to actual disputes. Cases that have actual stakes that matter and so on. Not to say that, this has no stakes involved. I'm sure that the people who are in the middle of this dispute would feel very differently from me characterizing it that way. To them, this is really hugely important, and I
Mhm.
get that. Um, but at the end of the day, it's mostly bragging rights. It's not, anything of great substance. Um, so arbitration in a case like this would be effective, but there's a couple different ways to approach it. If, like what you're suggesting, is if the arbitrator is somebody who comes from the community and is just saying, hey, I'm going to be the person who acts as the go-between. And by the way, there's a couple different approaches here. Arbitration and mediation are two very similar concepts, and they function slightly differently from one another, but functionally are basically the same. I'm not going to get into all the technicalities of it again. It's probably more information than you need. But I just want to make a really quick distinction: is that when we talk about arbitration, officially, arbitration usually has some kind of legally binding construct behind it, a statute or some kind of legal principle that gives it some legal force, something that can be enforced if somebody, decides that they want to break their agreement, right? It's usually when you have an arbitration, it's just like small claims court, right? You have somebody who acts as the neutral deciding party, right? So instead of a judge, you have an arbitrator, and then you've got the parties that present their cases. The advantage of arbitration is that it's much less formal than a court. So the typical rules of procedure and rules of decorum don't really apply the same way. It's a more comfortable setting for a lot of people. It allows people to, open up without all the pressures of being in a courtroom. Um, but, if you are doing an actual official legal binding arbitration, there are some disadvantages as well. For one thing, uh, the word binding actually means something. If it is binding arbitration, that means that whatever the arbitrator decides, the parties are bound to that decision. And if you don't like the decision, whether it's favorable or unfavorable to you, if you don't like the decision, uh, you're stuck with it. In a court, you at least have some ability to appeal if
Mm.
you don't like a judge's decision and you really want to go that route. There's usually a higher court that you can go to and say, hey, I didn't like this judge's decision. I think they got it wrong. Can you take a look at this? Whereas in an arbitration situation, you don't have that option. um, the other challenge of arbitration versus court is that, in things like small claims courts, depending on an individual's financial background, right? If you're somebody that doesn't have a lot of money, there are ways that you can get into small claims court without, driving yourself into bankruptcy. Court fees
Mhm.
for that sort of thing are usually pretty minimal. But with an arbitrator, usually an arbitrator, you have to pay up front, and you don't get to waive those fees. And depending on the kind of arbitration and the experience and special expertise of the arbitrator involved, the costs can be pretty high. It can even be prohibitive for certain people. I mean, a good mediator or good arbitrator in most cases is going to cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of between $500 and $1,500 an hour,
Mm,
right? Uh, and I'm willing to bet that the people involved in this circumstance probably don't have that kind of cash. Um, Now, you can go through a more community centered arbitration approach. And, you see this in a lot of cultures throughout the world. There are community forums where people get together and sort out their differences that aren't part of the official courts. And that is, considered a perfectly acceptable alternative. We see it a lot here in the United States too. We sometimes refer to this as restorative justice.
mm.
So if you have somebody, who's wronged someone else within a community, then the members of the community come together and they talk to that person, they work with that person, and they try to fix whatever has gone wrong. And that's a possibility for this situation as well. Is if there's enough people within that community that want to see peace, that want to see resolution, they might be able to make that happen. However, the flip side of that is that these sort of community arbitrations don't really have any binding legal effect.
Mm.
So it's really more of like a gentleman's agreement. It's really a good faith, honor system, right?
Yeah.
If somebody suddenly decides, you know what, I don't like this arrangement anymore, there's nothing really that can stop them from, you know, changing their side of things.
Mm.
They can change the terms of the bargain, or they can just ignore it, and there's not a lot that can be done at that point. So
If anything, like the best thing that could happen there would be like potentially the community could hold them accountable. Like maybe they don't want to break
mhm,
their agreement because they could jeopardize their reputation. And the point of all this is to have this reputation within this group, or that's a big part of it. You don't want to lose that, and so
sure,
you don't want the community to think that you've behaved dishonorably. But like they're only going to be so involved. Like you can't take that to the bank for
yeah,
sure. So I'd like to end with, if you've got just a couple more minutes,
sure,
with like what each of our potential advice would be. Not necessarily for this situation. We're not close enough to it, really, either of us to comment on it. But like
hmm,
more generally, and I'd like to lay out like what I think is the ownership model that makes sense for a battle league to avoid these kinds of things, and that's worked for us in No Coast for the last 12 years as we've changed control several times with no real upheaval. And
hmm,
then you can add to that like any kind of advice that you've got. And I'm sure like all the normal rules apply, right? If either party feels an agreement has been made about anything whatsoever, you should write it down in some form. Get like this is what the
yeah,
canonical copy of this agreement is, even if it's not going to be a formal contract, because it's not going to be like 9 times out of 10. But like I like to say just get it down in some kind of form, so both can say, oh yeah, it's not like a conversation that may have taken several different positions. It's like this is what was agreed, and that goes to hey, I'm going to show up and spit some bars on this date, or it goes to this is who I think is in control of this channel, and how I think that might change.
hmm,
But basically, I'm not into partial ownership. I don't think that these, sort of equal partnerships work for battle leagues. Maybe there's a way that it can, but I haven't had anyone explain to me how that might be. I've only seen it go bad. So like some party needs to have controlling interest, and I don't think there is any such thing as owning a minority share unless you've specifically written down this only applies if the entity were to be bought for some financial amount of money. In that case, an ownership stake could make sense to me. But anyway, I think that at any given time, you have one league head that has complete control in theory of all the resources, even if they're not the ones doing all of the work. They're actively involved, but no matter how many organizers are involved, and fewer is probably better, one person is the ultimate shot caller, and they may be the person doing the majority of the organization, or they may be just sort of overseeing different organizers, and we've had both situations. But the point is, if there's ever a branding dispute, like, hey, should we as an entity do this? Should we continue to work with this person? Should we do an event here? And it needs to be resolved. We all know who the person is that's going to make that call, and when they are no longer going to be actively involved, they need to pass that on sort of unilaterally to whoever they think the best person is. And that handoff is completely unambiguous. I 100% control no coast. The next day, Shake 100% controls no coast until he hands it out to someone else. And whoever is the person at the top of the food chain, they might not on a daily basis overturn anyone's decision, but they can. That is what I think works. And you know, the, there's that person has to be pretty well chosen and has to, know to hand it off at the right time when they're burnt out. But I think that makes the most sense personally. Um, let's see. So
Um,
then you have the organizers below them who have a lot of authority, um, and then general staff would sort of operate on a transactional basis. But that was the main point that I wanted to make. And then you can give all the recommendations you want, but it's just that like
mhm.
the talking about a 20% controlling stake when you don't even know what that would mean, like don't even mess with it. Like this
Yeah.
person has the baton until they pass it on. That's my take.
Yeah. So what you're saying about the transactional thing, I just want to touch on that really quickly before I go into the other thing. This is another going back to what we were talking before about the difference between, having a corporation and the, various powers and legal shield that a corporation offers versus an individual. And, when you're dealing with staff, when you're dealing with vendors, when you're dealing with venues on a transactional basis, that is something that you do have to be really careful with because if you're not operating as a business, then you are taking that individual risk yourself. If you say, for example, you contact a venue and you say, hey, we're going to do a rap battle on such and such night, and we want to use your space, and the venue says, okay, well, you got to pay me this much money up front, and then I get a certain percentage of the sales at the door or whatever. um, let's say you book 6 battles that night, and then 4 of your battles cancel out because somebody decides, I don't want to do this anymore, or I'm too lazy to show up, or whatever, right? If you've contracted with that venue individually, you're still on the hook for that stuff. You don't get to say, oh, it's the organization's responsibility, take it up with the organization, right? If you enter that transaction as Ray Myers, on behalf of Ray Myers, then Ray Myers gets stuck with the bill. Whereas
Mhm.
if you enter into that transaction as Ray Myers, president of No Coast, whatever, then you can kind of fall back on the organization. If the organization has no assets, has no ability to make that payment, you know, that's a risk that the venue takes by contracting with the organization versus the individuals. We're getting into some really technical stuff there, but what I want to say
No,
is
that's
that,
that is operationally that's a very good point, and I
yeah,
think that um, I think that works with everything that I've said as well. But
but
yeah,
I want to go back to the very beginning of what you were talking about, because I think you really hit the nail on the head from the outset, which is, if you want to run any kind of organization successfully, whether it's a business or a club or a nonprofit entity or whatever, if you want to run a structured organization, and you want it to last and you want it to function appropriately, you got to get everything in writing. um, And I think that is the challenge that a lot of organizations like these rap battle leagues face, is that there are very few, if any, people involved in those kinds of organizations that are willing to put the time and the effort and often the money into getting those things formalized. And when I say formalized, I don't mean necessarily registered with, your state or local government, right? It's not even necessarily that you have to be officially recognized as an entity or as a business, but just having the basic ground rules written out so that, people in the future have a reference point, right? You can't use a conversation as a reference point. You can't use a text exchange as a good reference point. It's more of a reference point than a verbal conversation, certainly. But even then, it's like, who's going to go through that trouble, right? Um, you said the partnerships probably wouldn't work in this scene. And I don't have any reason to disagree with you, honestly, because again, it really comes down to the willingness of the individuals in question to make the effort and to actually exhaust the time and energy required to, put some structure together.
Mhm.
That's the problem. And at the end of the day, because we're talking about rap battle, what is the defining characteristic of rap battle? What is the driving force? What makes rap battle?
That'd be conflict.
Well, not just
Okay.
conflict, but ego,
Yeah.
right? Ego is everything. If you aren't full of yourself, then you got no business being on the stage. And when you have an entire community built around this principle of ego, ultimately you're going to have egos that
Mm.
conflict with one another, and people are going to disagree about what the best course of an organization looks like. And so, if you want it to be a successful, long lasting organization, you got to take ego out of the picture. And that's hard to do. And even if it's something as simple as writing out, really basic bylaws, like, this is what the structure of the organization is going to look like. We're going to have a president, we're going to have a vice president, we're going to have a secretary, we're going to have a treasurer. We're going to have, meetings on such and such days, if that's the kind of thing you want to do, or, this person is going to be responsible for these tasks. This role is going to be responsible for these other tasks. Whenever we have a decision to make, here's the process that we're going to use. And whenever we want to change somebody's role, or if somebody decides to step down, whatever the case may be, here's the process that we're going to follow in order to make that change. Again, that takes effort, it takes time, it takes dedication. And, in something like this, which is really a labor of love, a lot of people, don't have the motivation to do all of that. Um, though I wouldn't say that nobody is willing to do it. There's always going to be at least one person out there who it will make it their life's mission. And, you know, if you can find that person, man, Godspeed, right? But at the end of the day, yeah, get it in writing, remove the egos, and make sure that you have a backup plan, because that's the other part that people often forget. People will have whole organizations mapped out, structured, um, but they don't ever have that fallback. What
Mm.
if something goes wrong? It's always a hard thing to tell somebody, as a lawyer, or even as a friend, right? Going into something like, hey, I'm going to start this relationship, right? You don't tell somebody when they say, I'm going to start a relationship, all right, plan for the breakup.
Yeah.
But when it comes
Absolutely.
to running an organization, that's what you got to do. You got to plan for the breakup, because no organization lasts forever.
That's fantastic advice. David, do you have anything you want to plug?
Right now, I encourage anybody watching this video to check out the No Coast page, check out the photo galleries that are up there. I put a lot of time into getting those pictures nice and pretty for everyone to enjoy. If you haven't seen them yet, um, take a look, like the ones that you like. Feel free to use them for your personal use. Just don't sell them or I will come after you.
All right, no idle threats. All right, well, thank you so much. Signing off.